Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second panel, when we'll discuss the more legal aspects, the euro versus national constitutions. So I'm very happy that we have this great panel here. Let me introduce the first speaker. This is Marco Mori. He's been a practicing lawyer for 10 years now in Geneva. He's the author of The Decline of Democracy, legal analysis of the genesis of a European dictatorship. And he's going to discuss the aspects of sort of the legal aspects of the financial system and how the euro also plays into that. Also the current attempts by the Italian government to sort of group all the bad loans from the Italian banking system into one bad bank, which then of course would be, the effects of that would be for taxpayers, first of all Italian taxpayers, but given the fact that the Italian system is indirectly backed up by the ECB, anyone who's holding euros. So please, Mr. Mori.
Grazie mille dell'invito.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for the five-star movement that has invited me to Brussels. I'm delighted to be here. So very briefly, because I want to leave time for questions, I want to specify why I'm always so harsh when it comes to the EU. I speak very frankly and I qualify it as a dictatorship because the EU is a new form of totalitarianism, different to what we saw in the past. However, what it has in common is all the key elements, including the fact that it has the strong desire to give itself legitimacy through a legal structure. In fact, any technical expert or lawyer who looks closely at the European treaties can immediately understand there's something wrong, that there was a predefined objective right from the start. So let's have a look at some of the provisions briefly. First of all, what does totalitarianism actually mean? Or what demonstrates it? The fact that the Parliament has taken out many of the rights that you usually have in a democracy. The Parliament is the place where legislation takes place via debate between different people, different movements and different ideas, elected on a very clear basis, namely popular sovereignty. So it's the European peoples that should be electing a parliament that should have specific legislative functions and not act as a deferred notary. That's what the parliament does. And what's lacking is the key legislative factor of right of initiative. Article 17 of the Treaty on the Function of the EU is perfectly clear here because it sets out legislative initiative at the behest of the European Commission. So the European Commission is not flowing directly from sovereignty. It's therefore removing lawmaking from the people, from the electorate. And what is even worse is that the doctrine of legislative independence from politics is no longer there because in Article 17 there is a ban on the Commission taking advice from the Member States or the European Parliament. So the Commission cannot take any advice from the people, from democracies, from those who are electing the members of parliament. This is the characteristic that is the preserve of totalitarianism. In Italy, we had fascism, which then led us to the Second World War. So what is the main characteristic of fascism? Namely, that the power of the parliament is subordinate to the executive power. So effectively, it removes the people from the decision-making power. This characteristic has been strongly countered by the Italian constitution that put the parliament at the centre in terms of its activity, and there is a ban on the executive taking on the power of the legislative. And that's not because there was a problem of governance, but rather the idea was that people should be represented in a chamber proportionately, and that should then express democratic will. So, first of all, for that reason, we can say that the EU is totalitarian, because people do not decide. Secondly, let's try to understand what kind of totalitarianism we're talking about. Once again, we're very far from what we saw in history, where totalitarianism was associated with nationalism, where a state wishes to impose its power at international level as well, its dominion. Europe is different. We could call it financial totalitarianism. So that's something new in terms of legal structure. And here again, I could use a few provisions of the treaties to illustrate this. There are just a few articles that show this concept. For example, Article 127 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU, which governs the European system of central banks, headed up by the ECB, gives a very clear objective to the ECB's and the system's policy. It says, first and foremost, price stability. This morning in the economic part, we heard what that means. But then it says something even more important in terms of destroying democracy. It says that price stability predominates over the Article 3 of the TFEU. So let's have a look at what those objectives are. If we look at that provision, we can see that those objectives are peace and the well-being of people, which, according to the treaty, are subordinated to price stability. So peace comes after price stability. The well-being of people comes after price stability. Ladies and gentlemen, these are laws that have been codified in this way. It's Europe that has given rise to them, and this is something that is very serious and very far away from the true nature of a democracy. And then another point which characterizes a financial dictatorship. What are we basing ourselves on? What's the value of Europe in economic terms? Competitiveness. What does that mean? If within a particular area or a setup, and here Europe that we'd like to see free and at peace, if we're fighting against one another, so if Italy's success has to go through the suffering of another state, that cannot work. So a national constitutional model, in Article 2, it talks about political, economic and social solidarity, and that model is diametrically opposed to competitiveness. If we allow unbridled competition in a market where the state is outside because it no longer has any powers of control over the economic sector, in other words, there's no room for democracy there, then we are entering a system with no democratic controls where there'll be one winner. And in fact, what we've seen in so-called neoliberal policies, we've seen the distribution of wealth over the years going to a very small percentage. There's a small percentage, 1% holding 99% of global wealth. And this is the model that's been enshrined in the treaties. And then we might wonder, is this a model that is no longer in line with the original thinking of the founding fathers? I'm talking about Rossi, Spinelli from the 28 group. If we read the fourth paragraph of their manifesto, we can see something very different to the usual story we hear. We see things such as the following three examples. 1, the people have some basic needs that need to be satisfied. However, they don't know exactly what they want or what they want to do. That's a very serious sentence. where the importance of popular sovereignty is undervalued and people are considered not at the level of democracy, whereas in fact they should be on an equal footing with it. So that's a terrible sentence. What's even worse in paragraph 4 is that it says, in the revolutionary period, democratic practice fails resoundingly. Now, with the revolutionary period, we can understand the start-up of the European Union, where there's no room for democracy. And you, as members, you experience that on a day-to-day basis when you realise you're helpless in the face of decisions that are handed down by economic powers. In fact, you have very little room for manoeuvre. And to conclude, I think this might be one of the worst sentences in the manifesto that no one ever remembers. Democrats do not refuse violence per se, but they only want to use it if the majority is in favour of its necessity. These are only to be used in an exceptional situation. Well, I don't know if that is really... I don't know if what we're seeing today is in the spirit of this original manifesto, and I do think we need to think about it very seriously because it has huge impacts. Turning back to the economic model, what did our founding fathers say? And I'd like to pay tribute to the Italian system. Given the situation we were in at the end of the Second World War, we'd had a dictatorship that led us to war, and we'd been razed to the ground. So when the Constitution was written in 1948, all attention was given to democracy and the highest human values. And with that in mind, our founding fathers were quite sure of the fact that it was neoliberal economic policy that had caused nationalisms that then led to war, and that Aldo Moro and Ghidini both said that it was necessary for the state to intervene to control, discipline and coordinate the economic sector. That doesn't mean communism, it just means that democracy can intervene to steer the economy and to put an end to this kind of situation. And the last point, as I wrap up, is how this dictatorship that's we now see intends to increase its powers via lawmaking. Well, this is the euro. As we heard from Professor Sapir this morning, the euro, which has led to an abandonment of sovereignty of economic and monetary policy on the part of the member states, has imposed constraints. It's meant that a state no longer has its currency. That's fundamental. People's sovereignty and currency. Well, then a state that no longer has a currency is no longer a state, so it is subject to blackmail by the economic powers that be. And as we heard from the founding fathers, that if the economy is allowed to prevail with no politics, it gets out of control. And during the war, we were occupied by troops, and today we're being occupied by the Maastricht Protocol, Protocol 12, the Stability and Growth Pact, the 3%, and the lack of monetary freedom where we cannot finance our state. All that can happen is that the state keeps taking on deficits and will at some point disappear. So we see the euro as the army in a dictatorship. What can we do? We have to reform the system. We have to destroy this system and come back and talk about it as sovereign people, respecting political, economic and social solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Then now I'd like to give the word to Gunnar Beck, who's a German national, but has been for a long time a constitutional lawyer in the UK at the University of London, has been both publishing theoretical pieces and practicing actual law. I remember he was also analyzing the so-called rechtsbruch, the violation of the famous no bailout rule. When Germany gave up the Deutschmark, that was always clear for everyone that the one condition was that if there would be a crisis, everyone would have to pay their own bills. I would always call it the most clear legal article in Europe, but it was violated. So please, Professor Beck.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming. In a sense, my paper follows on quite well from what we've just heard, because of course it is of course arguable that the EU treaties are biased in one way or another, or fundamentally even undemocratic. Now, I'd like to take my starting point here. I'd like to say three things very briefly right at the beginning. The question for this session is the euro compatible with national democratic constitutions? Strictly speaking, this is a misnomer. Our national constitutions aren't really primarily democratic. They have a democratic element, namely that our governments are elected every 4 or 5 years, but democracy is arguably not the most dominant feature of our national constitutions. Here the so-called liberal element seems to be far more important. Now, what I mean by the liberal element is that the constitutions focus on a set of rules which enshrine certain rights and the mechanics of government. So they define the powers of the relevant of a variety of institutions, and they define the limits on the powers of those institutions. So in other words, and I think that's my crucial point here, when it comes to the limits to the delimitation of government power, what our national constitutions are looking forward to are relying primarily on the rule of law and not so much democracy. That's really the crucial point I am making. Now, my second point is that whereas the previous speaker has primarily looked at the substantive content of certain provisions, I'd like to focus, I'd like to take those as given and in a sense argue that even if we don't question the nature of those provisions, then the euro could be preserved only by breaking those provisions. So not only may the actual rules be questionable from a certain perspective, the rules aren't even kept. So that's my point. And then thirdly, as is in the nature of legal papers, they are often very dull. I can't do very much about that, but I think it could serve as a useful reminder to you all that behind that veil of tedium and boredom, the law can do unspeakable things, right? And constantly does. Now, the German Basic Law, that's the official name of the German Constitution, has nothing to say on the subject of the euro, although it states that the Constitution is not itself incompatible with EU integration. However, the Basic Law places some limits on EU integration and thus by implication also on the degree of Eurozone integration that's permissible under the German Basic Law. Article 20 of the German Basic Law states that all state authority is derived from the people, and Article 38 guarantees the right to vote to every citizen. Now, all constitutions do that, but since the early 1990s, the German Federal Constitutional Court has made it clear that these two provisions, which seem like standard formulae, are not mere empty formulae in German constitutional law, but they must be given substantive meaning and importance. So the Constitutional Court held, by exercising their right to vote, citizens, German citizens, must be able collectively to influence the way they are governed and how they live. In other words, by exercising their right to vote, that vote must be, a meaningful choice must be capable of being made. It mustn't just be a pure formality, voting for a government who is already on a preset course of action and doesn't have much freedom of choice. Now, in its Lisbon judgment of 2009, the German court stated that the implications of this even more clearly. EU integration must not proceed to a point where it would threaten the model of the market economy, or the social market economy, or the German parliament's budgetary authority, i.e. its ability effectively to determine the levels of taxation and public spending, without which it would relinquish its ability to determine the basic living conditions of the German people. Now, in the Lisbon judgment, the court also reiterated its earlier famous Maastricht Treaty ruling of 1993, which stated that the German Constitutional Court retained a jurisdiction of the last resort over the exercise by the EU institutions of their powers under the treaty arrangements prevailing at the time. Put differently, the EU institutions must not interpret their own powers in a way which is incompatible with the German Basic Law as interpreted by the German Constitutional Court in its previous case law. If they do, the German Constitutional Court must, according to its own view of its own constitution, disapply their actions within the German jurisdiction. Let me try to explain this from a different angle. Whenever there's a new EU reform treaty, there are certain new clauses in that treaty. When the German Constitutional Court is asked to pass judgment on whether or not these new clauses are compatible with the German Constitution, it must form a view as to what these clauses mean. If at a later stage the EU institutions give a meaning to those clauses that wasn't originally intended and held to be compatible with the German Constitution, then by implication that exercise must be unlawful. That's why the German Constitutional Court has in theory reserved a certain competence to define the EU's competences to itself. Appropriately, this power in German is called the Kompetenz. Now, what does this mean in the context of the euro? Now, the court gave a clear answer to this in its Maastricht judgment. There were two articles of monetary union which the court deemed to be basic to the constitutionality of European monetary union. The first is what is now Article 125, the no bailout clause, which the court in its Maastricht judgment said prevented one state from simply passing on to others the consequences of its irresponsible financial policies. Now, regarding 123, which forbids monetary financing by the ECB, the German court, in its Maastricht ruling, that ruling which was crucial to holding European monetary union lawful under German law at all, regarding Article 123, the German court held that the purchase of government bonds by the ECB wasn't simply unlawful in the case of direct purchases, as stated in Article 123, but if we read Article 123 in accordance with the relevant Council Regulation 3603/93, there will be a slide on this later on, it is totally irrelevant whether the bonds are bought on the primary or the secondary market. So secondary market purchases via the capital markets are unlawful whenever they could entail monetary financing, i.e. the easing of public financing conditions of Euro governments by the ECB. So that is a very, very broad definition. And that very broad definition of the prohibition of monetary financing was held to be a condition by the German Constitutional Court of the constitutionality of monetary union. That's important. That was expressly stated in the Maastricht judgment. So, let's look at the facts now. In the wake of the euro crisis, euro governments very quickly began to ignore the no bailout clause and Article 123, and in 2012 instituted a permanent bailout fund, the so-called European Stability Mechanism. Let's quickly look at Article 125. That's the third slide, I believe. Yes. So I needn't read it out here. You see it on the screen. In summary, to those who can read, Article 125 is as clear as legal provisions can be. There is to be no mutual financial assistance between Eurozone governments, except for very specific projects limited in scope. Now, the German Federal Constitutional Court, when it had to consider the legality of the European Stability Mechanism, upheld its legality, notwithstanding the clear wording of Article 125. In its own previous Maastricht ruling that the establishment of European Monetary Union only complied with the basic law because Article 125 clearly prohibited any financial assistance between member states. Absurdly, the German court even held that the German contribution to the European Stability Mechanism of at least 195 billion euros, which could increase further in the event of the insolvency of another ESM member, was itself not incompatible with the preservation of the budgetary autonomy of the German Bundestag, notwithstanding the fact that the annual budget of the German annual federal budget in Germany only amounts to about 310 billion euros per year. So we're talking about 2/3 roughly of the annual federal budget, no problem, according to the German Constitutional Court, right? We can shoulder even more. Nothing. See, now, the Court of Justice, note, that is another modern form of German megalomania.
Two more minutes?
Sort of, sorry.
Two more minutes?
Right, okay. Well, let me give you one example of the perversion of the Court of Justice by the European Court of Justice, right? The problem isn't just a German one, it's a Euro-wide one. Now, the Court of Justice, in the Pringle case, likewise had to consider the legality of the Permanent Rescue Fund. It essentially based its argument on two foundations. The first is a quasi-literal argument. It says because there's an intermediate rescue mechanism, there is no direct subsidy or direct rescue of one country by another. The fact that it's intermediate is totally irrelevant, and the fact that a new debtor-creditor relationship is founded is also totally irrelevant. What matters, it's astonishing, the court totally ignores the fact that Article 125 is phrased far more widely and rules out intermediate rescue funds just as much as direct bailouts. And then secondly, if one looks at the ESM treaty, there are provisions that envisage precisely the assumption of responsibility that the Court of Justice says the ESM doesn't entail. So it's a totally disingenuous argument. Secondly, I think there is a quasi-teleological argument. Here comes next bit. Here that basically says, well, the point of the ESM is to ensure a sound monetary policy. Well, that's arguably true if everyone keeps to the rules, but what the court totally ignores is that policy, that the treaty makes a very clear choice that sound monetary policy is to be achieved through individual budgetary responsibility and not through the mutualization of debt. So the court's argument here is totally at variance with the actual wording of the treaty. So, I mean, in both these respects, the Court of Justice's argument or ruling in Pringle upholding the legality of the ESM under EU law is just as much of a legal travesty as the German Constitutional Court's ruling in the ESM ruling. Now, I mean, time is pressing. I wanted to say a few things about the Gauweiler case, another perversion of the Court of Justice by the European courts, but maybe we could leave this for discussion. I'm happy to come back to this. Let me just say a few final words about it and why all this matters. It is quite clear in international law that a treaty is to be given its literal meaning unless that literal meaning is unclear or the treaty has in some sense been frustrated. What we have with Article 125 as well as Article 123 are two provisions of the EU treaty with which one can of course take issue, but they are about as clear as they can be, and they've been willfully ignored by a central banker who's intent on subsidizing banks and doing the dirty work of a German chancellor. And all these, and both do what they do with a connivance of, I'm thinking of a word I'm tempted to use, but let's call them the grey men of Karlsruhe and Luxembourg. And what they all share, Draghi, Merkel, and Europe's top judges, is a fundamentally disturbed relationship with law.
Thank you very much. Strong words. Then I'd like to give the word now to Lydia Undiemi. She's a PhD in law and economics and the author of Blackmail of the Markets. She's also a technical consultant on outsourcing, and importantly was also one of the first people who denounced the issue of the Troika in Italy back in the days, I imagine, when the ECB also is sending letters to Mr. Berlusconi asking him to do a number of things which he then ignored, after which the ECB then stopped buying Italian bonds and basically putting the ECB in an incredibly political role, which is of course very unhealthy. But please.
Buonasera a tutti.
Good afternoon. Could we have a microphone for the speaker, please? Thank you. Now, don't worry about the introduction I've been given. I'm really just making this presentation because I've read the treaties, for example, on the ESM, but I'm going to be pretty technical and relevant here, so in spite of the fact that my field didn't sound as if it might be. Now, we have to look back to how the Eurozone crisis started here. The crisis began after the global financial crisis exploded in 2008. It started off on Wall Street and then moved on to the Eurozone countries because there were economic imbalances in those countries which were the result of the single currency. Now, it's very important to talk about the euro, of course, but we shouldn't forget the fact that the issues from the financial crisis can also affect countries which don't have the euro. So regulation problems need to be dealt with outside the specific case of the euro. We don't only have to talk about relations between states and new economic governance and the fact that Europe has a democratic deficit. We also need to discuss the possibility of reforming financial markets, not only at the European level, but also at the international level. Now, with my presentation, I wanted to briefly go over recent developments in economic governance. following the crisis in Europe, because a whole series of institutional rules and institutional changes took place, and looking at those shows us how far Europe has been from being a political union. The use of agreements under international law rather than rules under European law have meant, for example, that the creation of the ESM, which is basically the permanent troika mechanism, meant that a parallel entity was able to be set up alongside the European Union, because basically the ESM introduces a new entity under international law. So we have this governance framework, which is characterized by the inconsistency between the European Union based on the traditional treaties and the Troika, which is basically governed by another treaty and bilateral agreements, and they have basically been given the governance of the crisis. Now we're talking here 136 TFEU. That's the link connection between the two. So that has introduced the European Stability Mechanism into European law to try and deal with the need to face up with crises, not only on an ad hoc basis. There was already a rule for that, Article 121 on the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. So that provision already allowed Europe to deal with crises that may emerge. But as Europe is based on the paradigm of growth, then this would suggest that it would only be the markets that could produce positive economic growth and deal with unemployment, etc. And so the problem was that crises of this scope weren't envisaged under this rule. So then, when the crisis appeared, a decision had to be taken as to how to deal with it at the European level. There were also problems when it came to the UK not wanting to get involved in these mechanisms, and as the professor said, there were a whole series of matters because certain things couldn't be done under Articles 123 and 125. So slowly there were decisions taken to experiment on the ground. The experimental area chosen was Greece, and a whole series of measures were taken. The first measures taken that related to Greece were bilateral agreements, voluntary agreements between states, stating that these were voluntary loans, and in that specific case Article 125 wasn't violated. But then a further step forward was taken later on with the establishment of a further financial stability mechanism, and that was done pursuant to community rules. So that still was within EU primary law. Then a further assistance tool was created. That was a company under Luxembourg law. That was the European Financial Stability Facility. Eurozone countries had shares in that, and that had a capital of 440 billion euros, and that was also used for Portugal and Ireland. And here was when a step change took place, because this was incorporated under international law. It was a company in which Eurozone countries participated. But the great leap forward that we're now seeing took place with the modification of Article 136. Here we went further than guaranteeing the financial stability of the euro. I mean, here there were two paths that could have been chosen. Either this mechanism had to be made permanent rather than being ad hoc as they previously were, because the two stability mechanisms that I previously mentioned were based on Article 122. But the crisis is systemic, so new principles had to be introduced, and here I'm talking about Article 136. So there were two possible paths here. Either we continued working within European law, so attributing the management of the fund to European institutions directly, but that would have caused major compatibility problems, which would have been even greater than the current problems. Or another choice could be taken, and that's what we went for, i.e. creating this parallel organisation. And that was the ESM treaty, which basically permanently and institutionalized in a generalized fashion the modus operandi of the Troika. So what had been previously experimented as a series of extraordinary measures. So what's the role played now by the ESM, or the Troika as I call it? Basically they're the same thing, I think. I mean, the confusion derives from the fact that the ESM is a principle that was placed in Article 136, and then the organisation was named the same thing. But the role that the ESM plays within the Eurozone is basically the role that the IMF has played in the rest of the world in the past. I mean, the organisation is made up of Eurozone countries. There's the possibility of extending it to other countries, of course. And what's the purpose of the organisation? Well, it's basically to help countries who find themselves in economic difficulties, i.e. difficulties in funding themselves on the open market. But the quid pro quo is that the country that accepts the money has to carry out the reforms demanded by the organisation. Now, a significant difference, but politically speaking, between the European Union and the ESM, so the Eurozone countries, which are involved in both organisations, is that the voting mechanisms under the ESM Troika doesn't attribute the same powers to all countries, voting powers based on financial capacities. And in fact, if a country in difficulty can't pay its share, it loses its right to vote. So a country can find itself a partner under the ESM and a debtor when it's asking for a loan. Now, when a country in financial difficulties wants to get access to financial help and has to sign up to austerity conditions, reforms which southern European countries have carried out, well, that's when we see that democracy is basically subject to financial wheeling and dealing. So the dealing with the financial crisis in this way means that the crisis has essentially become a crisis of democracy. So I think that really is a key change that we've seen. So I think we can say that this is historically a very important phase, because within the European Union, we have the European Union based on the paradigm of growth, and we have the Troika that governs a Eurozone crisis, and that is based on the paradigm of crisis. So it's almost as if traditional Europe has created a state of emergency in a way. So moving on to the issue of the euro. Well, the Troika Treaty and the Fiscal Compact, as well as other agreements, come under international law, and so that means that the desire to deal with the crisis has meant that European economic governance has moved away from Europe and has moved towards an internationalization of economic governance. I mean, that's important here too, I think, because I mean, let's imagine that the euro is destined to disappear and that economic and monetary union is called into question. Well, the point is that we've created this new system of governance under international law. I mean, under European law, member states can draw up international agreements as long as they don't go against a European law. But we've now created this parallel system, which is now being developed, the transatlantic treaty as well. So we're developing a whole series of agreements that go far further than the European Union. So it's very possible that even were the euro to fall apart, we would find ourselves under a system of governance that would still maintain these problems relating to democratic deficits. So we've institutionalized the Troika with the ESM treaty. And having done that, I think we have condemned the European Union to being unable to deal with governance problems within member states. Then there's also the problem of the incompatibility of these new agreements with the rules contained in the fundamental treaties of the EU. And this has led to some very interesting developments, because the friction between German and European institutions has to be seen in political terms, because German judges, to a certain extent, have delegitimized in certain cases the opinion of the European Court in Justice by raising the idea of sovereignty. Well, that shows that sovereignty is more alive than ever in the European Union. And once you've delegitimized an institution, then you open a very different situation. That means that everything can be called into question. So that also, talking about sovereignty, I wouldn't say that states have really given sovereignty to institutions. I mean, I think it's slightly different, actually. I mean, states do have to maintain the principle of sovereignty to continue to be considered states in the international ambit. I mean, it's not really possible to give up sovereignty, I don't think. For example, the treaty between the Troika and the countries in difficulties don't impose solutions. I mean, it has to be done slightly differently. For example, if you look at Cyprus, the Troika suggested taking money from people's accounts, and the Cyprus government refused because it was a clearly unpopular measure. So things weren't necessarily done that way. Over a week, given the tensions that there were over possible capital flight, pressure was put on, and the island was forced to adopt the reforms. But that means that there is a need for national institutions. These rules do have to go through national parliaments and institutions. And we can only really deal with these issues if we're aware that the balance of power between states and markets is something that needs to be taken into consideration. I mean, there really is a problem when it comes to the balance of power between markets and states as things stand at the moment. Now, looking at capital, the move to the current neoliberal phase has to be interpreted in the sense of a progressive increase in the power of international capital, because all these rules give international capital a certain level of power. For example, looking at the Troika, well, they can use external sources of finance as well as the quotas from Eurozone states. So external investors, large-scale capital, can participate in investments, and they can also take part in the meetings in which the conditions are decided for financing as observers. So who can exclude the idea that international capital may well be able to have an influence on the reforms called for? And if we look at the reforms that have been required, well, basically, labour rights have been the main area in which interventions have taken place. Workers' rights have been decreased, and there has been a progressive destruction of social security and the welfare state. So if you look at the political dimension of those reforms, it's clear that this clash between Troika and states, or markets and states, really ends up being a kind of class struggle, as it were, a struggle between capital and labour. And then obviously capital is politicised more than it ever has been in the past, because the free market suggests that there shouldn't be any rules on the movement of capital. When we took away rules on how capital should move within member states, well, then we basically bowed to the neoliberal system. But I'm going to go back to the initial problem here. We have to reflect on the fact that this financial and economic globalization that doesn't work, quite apart from the euro. I mean, large-size banks that are gaining in power, etc. All these issues need to be dealt with. Now, there have been developments on the ground where it comes to the rights of workers and the interests of large banks. And I noted that a major factor when it comes to the destabilization of international markets is the rules adopted by multinationals and the possibility that multinationals have not to establish themselves as a single organization, but as a kind of series of, as a holding company that controls many different companies and businesses. Internationally, there are rules that attribute direct responsibility to holdings for the operations of their subsidiaries. But all too often, this legal mechanism basically makes it even easier for multinationals to shift their initial losses to the places where they want to shift them to. That often means that European funds have been used to bail out banks, but we also lack legislation that can protect states from these kinds of financial problems. So by bailing out banks without properly regulating markets, we're basically creating the conditions for another problem in the future. And to stop those kinds of problems, we're going to have to look at how we can set up a series of international agreements to regulate financial markets.
Thank you very much. Now, before we go to the Q&A, I just raise a number of issues regarding the things that have been mentioned. So perhaps first for Mr. Mori and Ms. Ndieme. So what would you, I think many people would agree that all the sort of the conditions that are linked to the ESM loans, for example, that there's a lot of abuse, that there's a lot of lack of democracy there. You can call it dictatorship, perhaps strong, but that there's a big issue there. But how would you address the argument that a country like Spain, a country like Greece, they still had the freedom, the opportunity to say, we don't want a loan. So then we also don't need to have the conditions. Similarly, with international banks, I think many people would agree that the system is out of control. Look at the derivatives bubble. But if you look into it, then the whole financial bubble really started after the gold standard in 1971 was ended, because this was the break on enormous explosion of debt. Now, there was always, there was a demand for debt. Governments have been spending out of control. They refused to balance the budgets, so necessarily they had to go into debt. So as much as many people would agree with you, yeah, it's very unhealthy that we have such a powerful financial sector. What about those first responsible, those who took out the loan, who refused to balance the books and restrain spending? How would you? I would be interested how to deal with those arguments. Both of you first.
Allora, questo è un tema centrale.
Well, this is a central topic. In fact, Lydia recalled quite rightly that the choices on the part of Greece or Spain and ours as well have gone through national parliaments. However, there were national parliaments that had their... Well, did they really have their independence and sovereignty? No, they didn't, because of the exceptions to monetary sovereignty, or the fact that they'd given away some of their sovereignty. If a state doesn't have its own currency anymore, then it doesn't technically have that power. The president of the Italian Constitutional Court, Zagrebensky, in the past, said that if Italy doesn't have its currency anymore, then it doesn't have its sovereignty. What can a state do without a currency? It can fail. That is a terrible concept if you see the distinction between public and private law. A state cannot fail or go bankrupt. It can do about good or bad policies. But what's happened in Europe, there's a European Central Bank which does not act as the lender of last resort. So it cannot give money to the states. Gian Amato, Italian politician in the Constitutional Court, who was criticised for being anti-European, has denounced this on television, that we created a European Central Bank, but we were wrong to do so. It was a mistaken wager. Because once the bubble bursts, we don't have the legal instruments, because the state was constrained by having to have a balanced budget, but without its currency. If I don't have a currency, then I cannot conduct an expansionary policy. A balanced budget has nothing to do with economic policy, but it's simply ridiculous. So how can the state give wealth to its citizens? That's what we need to remember. As Keynes used to say, we're now being so sophisticated in our analysis that we're forgetting the basics. The state, our currency and our savings, where does that come from? That's a state deficit. In fact, Article 47 of our Constitution, before there being any distinction between internal rules, in 47 it says that the state has to protect savings. How does it create savings? It creates it with deficit policy. So monetization of the debt, that simply is irrelevant here. Now, the problem is that you have to use your economic sector, your own currency, well, so that it remains its value. If you pump in too much money into an economy, it creates inflation. However, it isn't possible to keep having austerity policy if you don't have your own currency. These policies, as Lydia said, simply serve to take away power from the democratic state. And who's the power or the sovereignty going to? Now, it isn't even in these institutions here. It's the markets that hold the power. It's the financial powers. This question leads me to mention something said by one of the founding fathers in 1947, so just after the end of the Second World War. Gustavo Guidini said that if you allow free competition to prevail unbridled and personal profit to be the main principle, you get to super capitalism. And one of the consequences would be the war that has destroyed so many people. So is it possible to talk about a communist project? Usually that's the criticism. Whenever anyone talks about democratic control of the markets, you get told you're a communist. You forget that there's something in the middle of neoliberalism where there's no state, and communism. There's a whole range of nuances in the middle of that. Now, Guidini replied that it isn't possible to talk about a communist project. Now, it's true that there are constraints on the limits to property, because we don't want there to be large concentrations of property which remove from any private initiative many players. Now, if it's possible to lead to higher productivity, the problem is that the political sector will overlook the benefits of the collective. And that's exactly what's led to misery we have at the moment. Now, if we allow this kind of setup, living for the financial markets alone, with no democracy, if the people no longer have any power, then I'm shipwrecked, as it were. So we need to destroy this setup and review it internationally. We need to give back sovereignty to the people with respect to the power of the markets. The founding fathers also said how this was going to finish. Unfortunately, history repeats itself. If we continue along this path, we're going to end up with a third world war. That's the truth. And that's the real drama. It's not rich against poor, but it's about survival of civil society.
Okay. Io credo che comunque il discorso...
Well, I think the question you asked is very relevant because it really takes us to an issue of the regulation of financial and monetary markets at the global level. The divorce between the Treasury and the Bank of Italy has been mentioned, and let's just recall that that did nothing else than transform fiscal policy. But let's recall that that was during the time when the world was going through the financial crisis that had been established by the US's restrictive monetary policy, which had caused problems for countries who were in debt. So financial market regulation needs to be looked at to try and avoid imbalances upstream. Perhaps that's what the IMF was trying to do. Originally, that was part of its function. So when Italy managed this divorce between the Treasury and the Bank of Italy, that was the intention. I mean, when neoliberal policies emerged, it was difficult to sell Italian bonds as well. So this was perhaps a mistaken effort to try and provide a solution to that problem. Now, sovereignty, to go back to that, well, I don't think that there is a problem in terms of a dictatorship. I mean, at the end of the day, states have different political strengths, but I mean, they can make their rights prevail, as Germany's doing in financial markets. But when it comes to pressure, that can be exercised by multinationals, and so it can even paralyze the democratic process at times. But I don't think we've reached the point where we can say that there's a dictatorship. I mean, apart from anything else, that would remove responsibility from domestic politicians. I mean, I fought very hard to ensure that the fiscal compact, etc., weren't adopted, but it was Italian elected representatives that did adopt those things, that agreed to them. So there is a balance that needs to be struck between the sovereignty of a state and the proliferation of these kinds of international organizations, which basically dominate the political scene now. I think we have to look at this in a balanced way, because otherwise it's very difficult for us to come up with an appropriate response to what's going on. And just to conclude, let me say that it's this process of internationalizing of European governance that's causing a problem. I mean, countries are drawing up agreements outside European law in which several member states are involved, and I think that really puts the sovereignty of states at the heart of this new definition of governance, because it's not only the European Union that the state has to deal with, it has to deal with several international organizations. So really it's the state at the heart of several different international organizations.
Professor Beck, just one more issue for you. I mean, do you think there's some limit when the German Constitutional Court judges will really have no other way than to actually put a significant brake on any of the Eurozone bailout action?
Well, there is a case before. Very briefly, of course, I talked about Pringle. Pringle, of course, is no isolated judicial aberration. There's the recent Gauweiler case. The German Constitutional Court, first time round when it referred the matter to the Court of Justice, stated quite clearly that in its view, the ECB's first bond buying program was unlawful, even under EU law. Now, the Court of Justice brushed that aside and said it's all fine and quite as it should be. So now the German Constitutional Court has to make up its mind whether it's going to submit or assert itself. It will be humiliated if it submits. I think it will submit.
All right. Very clear. Well, we still have around 10 minutes for Q&A. Yes.
We need a microphone for the speaker, I'm afraid.
All right, go. I'll change places.
Okay, now it's working.
Now it's working. Okay. Never mind the clash between European and national state law. May I ask the panelists the following question? I consider that the International Monetary Fund, under its charter as articles of agreement as modified, has no business lending to any single member state of the Eurozone without those debts being guaranteed by the totality of member states of the Eurozone. In other words, if the IMF chooses to lend to Greece under its articles of agreement, that loan, the soundness of that loan, should be guaranteed by Germany, putting it as sort of provocatively as I can. Do you agree with that interpretation? And if not, why not? The IMF is meant to lend, I repeat, to sovereign entities, but if you can't change your exchange rate, you're not a sovereign entity.
Sorry about that. Okay. My answer will be somewhat unsatisfactory because I haven't got prior notice of the articles of the IMF. So consequently, I cannot now form a view in all haste as to whether or not Greece is a sovereign state. However, what I can say is the following. Well, a variety of scenarios. If the IMF lends that money, it should bloody well know that under EU law as it stands, Germany can't or shouldn't bail out Greece. So in fact, I think that so it would in fact require a breach of EU law as a condition of the lawfulness under international law of its own law to Greece. I think this is a highly questionable proposition.
Therefore, therefore the IMF should not take part in such lending.
Correct, I agree.
Thank you.
And no one else should either.
Right.
Yes, gentleman in the back.
Yeah, my name is Diarmuid O'Flynn. I'm an assistant with Luke Ming-Flanagan. He's an Irish MEP. Just point of information, speaking about constitutions, the Supreme Court in Ireland yesterday finished hearing a case that was submitted by an Irish Member of Parliament, Joan Collins, on the constitutionality of what has become known in Ireland as the promissory notes. And the promissory notes were issued in 2010 when two Irish banks, small Irish banks, non-systemic, were insolvent, about to go under. There were no, as we well know, there was no structures in place in the EU at the time to deal with insolvent banks. But between themselves and the Irish government and the Irish Central Bank, they came up with a fudge, which they're very good at doing, where the Irish government issued basically just a one-line, two-line note saying that they would guarantee these two insolvent banks. And what the governor of the central bank has told us was that then this immediately made those banks solvent, and they then used the Emergency Liquidity Assistance Fund to create 31 billion euro for those two small banks to pay off the failed creditors of those two failed banks. And what Ireland is now at the moment having to do is borrow that money in tranches and take that money back out of circulation because those two banks subsequently went into liquidation. And what this Member of Parliament is questioning was that the Irish Finance Minister, in signing off these notes and creating that debt for the Irish people, never went to the Irish Parliament, never brought this before the Irish Parliament. And just to put this in context, 31 billion euro in 2010 was 5 billion euro more than the entire tax take for the Irish government that year. That includes income tax, corporate tax, and capital gains tax. It was 5 billion more than that. So with the stroke of a pen, he spent 5 billion more than the government took in that year to bail out 2 insolvent banks. So she has, that case was heard, the last day was yesterday. So we're waiting now on the result of that case. And on it could fall a huge amount of what has happened in Ireland in the past 4 or 5 years. The Pringle case that you spoke of, that was another Irish TD, another Irish Member of Parliament that took that case here. What I'd like to know is, is this kind of thing happening anywhere else in Europe, where people are taking specific instances to their own courts, appealing like breaks in the Constitution in their own courts?
Okay, well, maybe quickly, and then one more question after that. Sure, please.
Ma noi in Italia abbiamo avuto un caso simile.
Well, we had a similar case in Italy recently. The Italian government was stopped from intervening by the European Commission that believed that an intervention to bail out certain banks that were defaulting would be state aid. You've probably heard about the cases, I don't know. But more interesting than that, I think, I don't know what Irish law envisages here. I don't know what there is in your constitution. I don't know whether it was legal or not. That would be something that would have to be looked into. I don't know what to tell you there. But what I can say is that there's no reason why a national government shouldn't bail out its own banks. A banking system's based on trust. You all know that banks create money when they lend money. They're not lending out what they've harvested. this is a macroeconomic issue. So given the financial creativity of banks and given that deposits can't guarantee liabilities, well, how can you let a bank fail? If people work out that banks aren't solvent, then they take their savings out and the banking system collapses. That's the spirit pursuant to which the European Union created the famous banking union. At the end of the day, banking clients are turned into the guarantors of something that they can't guarantee. That's the role that states should have, and they should provide the guarantee via their central bank. Basically they're not allowed to do that anymore. So we have to be a bit careful, I think, when we constantly focus on the idea of gross debt, because when you have deflation in Europe, which we do at the moment, well, then there's less money in the real economy than is necessary. Well, that's when we have to get worried. But what we shouldn't be doing is implementing restrictive policies to deprive states of their sovereignty when it comes to the decisions they want to take on these kinds of things. I think that's really the key here.
Thank you. Then maybe one more question from the gentleman. Yes.
Tack så mycket för ordet. Vill först och främst
Yes, thank you very much. I would first like to thank you for this very interesting hearing and for all these interesting issues brought up by this panel of people who are clearly specialists in their areas. Now, I have a question for Mr. Marco Mori. Now, it's on some of the views that you've put forward today. Now, I share many of your views. My party shares many of them. I'm Pavel Gomo, and I am a member of the Swedish Parliament, and I was invited to participate today here by Peter Nadla Lundgren, who's a member of this house. But, Mr. Mori, you have painted a very dystopian picture of a future with greater conflict and possible war. And you've put this in relation to the Euro cooperation. And I personally and my party share those views with you. We feel that the Euro cooperation has put a lot of pressure on the European public and led to regional disparities, and this has led to great tension in not just the Eurozone but within the EU. But does the future look quite as gloomy as you're painting? I would, of course, hope that it doesn't, but I would like to have a bit more information. Mr. Mori, how do you view the future? Where precisely are we heading? Does the future look quite as dark as one might be tempted to think based on what we've heard here today? Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you for that question. If we look at the events and what's happening and where it's taking us, then a very dark future seems almost likely, completely likely. I've written that in my book. Now, I hope it will be possible to intervene politically, because up to today, the EU, the totalitarian EU, isn't yet complete. So it's just a dictatorship in embryonic form. We could intervene politically. Now, the problem that I see may be less than in your group. Now, I think it's in the national parliaments that they're further away from the reality than you are, so they don't really understand as well. So I think that's where intervention is needed. Now, what should we do to avoid the worst? I think we need a reform in the UN, and quite apart from the EU. What was the problem that put a brake on any attempt to democratize the system within the UN? That's because there are only 5 countries with the veto rights. If we want a global democracy, what are we going to do? We're simply acting in the post-war situation if we only give vetoes to those who won the war. So I think this is where we need intervention. If we don't take away the veto right, we're not going to move forward. What about what happened in Argentina? Now, everyone agreed with them, but they weren't given the veto rights. So if it's the financial interests that are dictating, and that's what's happening because of growing economic power, then we don't have any solution. So we need to have a global democracy which puts the balance of power on a more level playing field.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the speakers. So let's give them a round of applause. So the next session will start at 15:45.
Thank you.
All right, cheers. All right.
French? Trombetta.
De Mario Draghi.
Vuoi sei ancora qua? Ancora c'hai?
I have to go. Yeah. Yeah. Sure, yeah.
Mais est-ce qu'il pense que Draghi peut sauver l'économie italienne
Good.
avec ce mesure?
Hey, how are you?
Mais est-ce qu'il pense que Draghi travaille pour les Italiens ou pour les banques? Oui. La situation économique en Italie maintenant, c'est grave. Pas au moment.
considerazioni silence.
On prend un café? Oui. Vous habitez où en Italie?
In Italy?
Mais où en
Palermo.
Italie?
Palermo.
Ecco, fai sedere. So, please, colleagues.
I'm so sorry, but
we should start the third panel, so please take your seat.
Follow us on the streaming.
Yes, we are web streaming. So. Grazie e partiamo con la terza parte.
Thank you. So let's get started on the third part of our conference, the political part of this discussion. We're going to hear from representatives of the three different political groups who are involved in organising this. To my left, my colleague Paavo Väyrynen, if I'm pronouncing the name correctly, who, well, as he said earlier, he's a member of the ALDE group, a Finnish representative of that group. Then to my right, we have Professor Starbati, who is a member of the ECR, European Conservatives and Reformists group. And then we have my colleague Marco Valli, a member of the Five Star Movement and the EFDD group, Europe for Freedom and Direct Democracy. I'm going to give the floor straight to Mr. Väyrynen for his intervention. We're going to have 10 or 15 minutes worth of presentations from our colleagues up here, and then we're going to open the floor for discussion. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I'll start with history. As I mentioned in the previous session, in 1995 I was in the European Parliament and I was against the euro as a single currency. I accepted euro as a common currency so that the national currencies would have been maintained. I was against the euro as single currency for both economic and political reasons. I thought that the European Union is too large and too heterogeneous to form an optimal currency area. It would not work. And secondly, I saw that the whole project was more political than economic. The federalists in the European Union and in the Parliament wanted to have euro in order to promote the idea of developing the European Union into a federal state. They thought that if we all have the same currency, we have more European, let's say, spirit and atmosphere. It removes obstacles from deeper integration. And on the other hand, they thought that if you have common monetary policy, then you have to have common fiscal policy and a federal state. It was very clear, all this. Well, of course, we lost. We were then 5 centre-partists from Finland, 2 from Sweden. We all were against, except Olli Rehn, who was then a member of parliament from my party. The second step in the discussion was the question of forming first a smaller currency area Karl Lamers and Wolfgang Schäuble published in 1994 an article where they proposed that first there would have been only 5 countries in the Eurozone, France, Germany and the Benelux countries. They argued that these countries are similar enough, they are integrated amongst themselves enough in order to form an optimal currency area. And they proposed that these 5 countries would go deeper also in their political integration, and they would form the hard core of the European Union. That was an excellent idea. They would have had euro as a single currency, and the rest of the Union would have used euro as a common currency besides their national currencies. Excellent idea, but it was not accepted, and this large eurozone was created. In Finland, we had then a large based government. Paavo Lipponen was the prime minister then. Sauli Niinistö was finance minister. He is now our president. We entered the eurozone against our constitution. We did not have any referendum. There was only a communication to the parliament. Not even a bill was passed to the parliament, only a communication. And since a large majority of the members of parliament accepted this procedure, we joined the euro. There was a referendum in Sweden, and majority of the Swedes were against. The same happened in Denmark. So Finland is the only Nordic country which is a member of the eurozone. We have been suffering a lot economically of our membership. It can be seen very clearly when we compare Sweden and Finland. These countries are very similar. Their economies are very similar. They both are very dependent on foreign trade, export, and the main sectors of export industry are the same. Since 2008, the Swedish economy has grown by now about 10%, and it is still growing. This year prediction is about 3–4%. Finland has decreased by 6% during the same period. The difference is 15–16%. It is enormous difference. And of course, because of that, we have high rate of unemployment. We have big deficit in the public sector, since the national economy has been shrinking, but the public sector has been maintained, or even it has been growing. And now our government is trying to improve the competitiveness by internal devaluation and by cutting the public expenditure. Of course, both are decreasing economic growth in our country. A year ago, the Ministry of Finance had a prediction that we could have had, in average, a growth rate of 1% per year for this electoral period. Because of this austerity policy, I believe that we are going to have zero growth. I'm convinced that if we leave the eurozone and can immediately improve our competitiveness, we could have, in average, a growth rate of 3% for the coming years. It is a huge difference with the zero growth option. In Finland, the situation is rather strange. We are suffering from our membership in the eurozone. We have 2 major parties in the government which should be in favor of a fix-it. The True Finns party, the populistic party led by Timo Soini, has been very critical about the euro, and almost all their members of parliament before the election said that it would be better for Finland to be outside the eurozone. The Centre Party was almost unanimously, in practice unanimously, against the membership of Finland in the Eurozone. And these two parties form almost a majority in the parliament. But still we don't have any discussion in the parliament about the possibility of leaving the Eurozone. In these circumstances, I made last summer a citizens' initiative on a referendum concerning the Finnish membership in the Eurozone. I had to propose a referendum because the law prohibits a kind of citizens' initiative which is against our external obligations. So you cannot make a citizens' initiative proposing that we should leave the Eurozone, but a referendum can be proposed. And now I have got more than 53,000 signatures. I have been able to hand over the initiative to the Speaker of the Parliament, and in the end of this month there's going to be a discussion in the plenary session, and the initiative is sent to the committees to be dealt with. So in the future the members of Parliament are compelled to take a position if we should leave the Eurozone and if there should be a referendum. Of course, when we are now inside the Eurozone, only logical question in the referendum can be leaving the Eurozone. So if the Parliament joins the initiative, it would take a position that we should leave the Eurozone. And then the Parliament would ask the government to prepare a bill about the referendum to leave the Eurozone. But of course, if the majority of the Parliament is in favor of leaving the Eurozone, there is a more simple way, and that is that the government can give a communication to the Parliament of leaving the Euro. Since we went inside the Euro using a communication, it is logic that we can also leave using the same method by only communication. But of course it is hard to get the majority. And since there has been a lot of resistance in the Parliament among the political parties, I had to make a rather drastic move. In the beginning of this year, I established a new political party by the name Citizens' Party. It is quite a move for a man who has been all his life in politics. I have been party leader, deputy leader first in 1970s, party leader in 1980s. I'm now honorary chairman of the party, and I have been in the party leadership for almost all my life. And now I had to establish a new political party in order to get support for the citizens' initiative and for the Fix-It. Of course, there were also some other reasons for my dissatisfaction with my party. I would say that the representative democracy in Finland is not working well. And I have a feeling that there are some other issues where I have to try to gather political support for a change in the country. And the most important, of course, is to be able to leave the Eurozone. What would happen if we would leave? Of course, we would stay in the European Union. I have a feeling that if Finland would break the ice and leave, then some others might also leave. And that could lead to a situation which could be close to the Schäuble-Lammers idea from 1994, having only 5 countries inside the Eurozone. That might be possible. So this could be a way out. The others are very complicated. In the previous session we discussed the possibility of have a coordinated break-up. It is extremely difficult, of course, to discuss and agree on this kind of measure. So maybe it is the only possibility in practice that one country would leave and the others would follow. And Finland, of course, is the best candidate because our economy is not that bad yet, so that it is easier to go compared with countries like Greece, which is so heavily indebted. And also in our country, if democracy would work, we could have a majority in the parliament. But the democracy is not working well enough yet. But maybe my Citizens' Party is going to be so popular that the others have to take into consideration our existence and our policies, and they have to follow our line. Let's see. We are living in interesting times. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paavo, for your good contribution. And now I give the floor to Professor Starbatti.
Wir haben heute Morgen gehört.
This morning, when we talked about the Eurozone, we heard that for southern countries, the level of currency is too high, for the northern ones too low. So that means for those countries for which the euro is too weak, they need to be subsidized. This is a classic beggar thy neighbor policy example, where employment policy is done via the exchange rate. For Germany, it means that exports are subsidized because of the level of the euro that's too low, and imports are effectively taxed. Conversely, if the euro is too high, then it means that exports are taxed and imports are subsidized. And what that means is that in one country, unemployment goes down in Germany, whereas in other countries it increases. And you can see that from the statistics. However, no one in this parliament actually wants to hear that. Now, people talk about having an analysis. Now we have a monetary policy. Now, monetary policy can be very expansive to try to bring more money, but an incorrect exchange rate cannot be alleviated via expansionary policy. All that will bring about is ruining the economy. I can imagine that the next bubble that comes up will be larger than the bubbles that we've already experienced. Madam Merkel is trying to correct this wrong exchange rate by forcing internal austerity policy. But if one price is changed, all prices have to be changed via wages. And this is the toughest process that she wants to introduce, and it's being done with a lot of Euro countries. Now, why are people in favour in Germany? Well, for large industry, they're in favour of the Euro. It's very comfortable if exports are subsidised and competing products are taxed. So our large industry is in favour. And Mrs. Merkel wants to keep using austerity policy to bring about a balance with respect to internal devaluation. And all economists know that that can work. Now, it's interesting that a lot of Europeans think differently to what we've been saying. Now, Yves Mersch, the Vice President of the European Central Bank, he said in front of the German Constitutional Court that any currency monetary union is a liability community. He said it very clearly. Effectively, it is a liability community. Recently, I heard Mr. Padoan, the Italian Minister of Finance, who said that previously we had an exchange rate as a mechanism, adaptation mechanism. Now we have the labour market. Through unemployment, we can bring down real wages to make us more competitive. But it's a very tough adjustment mechanism. That's why we need distribution of wealth through social security systems. And I said, I don't really understand. How can you correct the wrong price through redistribution? This is just about redistribution. Then the banking union is also a form of redistribution. Every union is a liability community. And if we look at mutualizing insurance or deposits, then those who've saved will be taxed to the detriment of those who haven't. Now, if I look at what Juncker is doing to make this palatable, we can see which direction we're going in. And that's exactly what President Juncker is doing. Everyone knows that if you have a community based on liability, then it's doomed to failure. Economists know that. It means that we have to have collective good or common good. That's the Eurozone. Some people pay more, others are free riders, and then that leads to moral hazard. So this community based on liability is bound to failure. Aristotle said this, that if everything is communitarized, then you get some people who have too great a responsibility. And when we look at what we're doing, then we have Greece as a case. That's been discussed, so has Finland. If in 2010, when Greece was bankrupt, in fact, it is bankrupt, all we're doing is just delaying the bankruptcy. If at the time we'd said to Greece, well, you can leave and you'll get 50 billion euros to help you on your way, that would have been cost effective. It would have been good for Greece, but it wasn't done because, in fact, the Chancellor in Germany and the finance minister suggested it. But why wasn't it done? That's because the French, the Brits, the German, Spanish banks had huge exposures in Greece. So Greece was saved to save the banks. It was always a bank bailout. The ESM was also a bank bailout at the start. So we need to look at what we really want. Do we want to save banks or save countries? Now, really, we should want to save countries. If we want to bail out countries, then we have to ask ourselves whether these countries have a business model. Do they have a business model which allows them to create enough employment for people in their country? That has to be the question. Now, young Greeks are all sitting on their packed suitcases wanting to emigrate. Greeks are intelligent. We see that again and again. We can see just how intelligent they are when they're put to the test. And if the Greeks leave, which investors are going to go to Greece if all the best people have left? So that's the situation we've got there. Now, this morning, we heard, Alpha, my group, said this quite early, that if Greece leaves, then effectively there'll be a debt write-down of about 80%. That's also being discussed. Mrs. Lagarde has actually proposed this in the IMF. It's very simple. If Greece gets debt relief within the monetary union of 80%, well, that's very convenient, isn't it? Well, what about if it's in the same situation 5 years down the line and then gets another debt write-off? And why should Greece get debt write-down if the Portuguese and the Irish had to fight tooth and nail to pay off their debts? So if Greece gets a debt write-down within the monetary union, everyone else is going to want it. If they get 80% of their debts written down, that can only happen outside the Eurozone. Otherwise, people will say it's too expensive. But it isn't too expensive. It's just a budgetary mechanism. On the asset side in Greece, we could just say they're very dubious anyway. So it's really just a balance sheet adjustment. If you're saying 80%, it's actually 0%. If the Greeks stay in, we know that when they're going to pay them off. As ad infinitum or calendes grecques, as it were. We're never going to pay them back. And we know that Greece is relatively flexible. They've said, now we know the J-curve effect and the flows, but let's imagine that Greece wanted to devalue by 30%. Well, the beaches would be full immediately. The tourists would go there immediately. The hotels and all the trades would do really well. So I love Greece. It's a wonderful country. The beaches aren't too built up. People are very friendly. If you go and if I go and eat in a restaurant with my daughter, get desserts for free. So Greece is wonderful. But obviously, the question is that the internal buying power, purchasing power would then come down. That means that medicines would be more expensive, for example. But now I have nothing against us paying money to help with these adjustments for the very difficult transition period. And I think that would be appropriate. What we're doing now is simply throwing money into a big hole. But if Greece leaves, people are worried that others will leave. What's the problem then if Portugal leaves or Spain leaves as well? What if they then want to be able to recover somehow through a devaluation, keep employment in their country? We always forget that. In Spain, young people are also sitting on their ready suitcases. In Portugal, unemployment has gone down. Well, that's because young people have left. So I think that's the best solution. That's interesting. The French don't want it. Mrs. Sapir said that. With the devaluation for Greece, Spain, Portugal, France, a devaluation would then make competition harder. And this morning we talked about global market share in world trade. For Germany, it's about 9.5%. For France and Italy and Spain, the 6% proportion would go down to 3%. We can see they've lost competitiveness at world level. So if the Greeks leave, then we have to help them. We have to help them get back on track in economic terms so that the country doesn't become a permanent zombie state. And we know countries that become dependent on cash support from outside. We don't want to have a Europe of zombie states. We want a Europe of independent states where we can interact freely, where people are independent, where there's the rule of law, and where Greeks can walk around Europe with their heads held high and not have to say thank you to the Germans for financing them all the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Starbati, for your contribution. And now I give the floor to Marco Valli.
Thank you, Marco. Prima di tutto vorrei ringraziare il...
Well, I'd like to begin by thanking our two colleagues here, and particularly the professor from Germany, because they're the first two German colleagues in the Parliament who admit the advantages that Germany is enjoying in Europe thanks to the euro, and how they're in a sense cannibalizing the internal market of the eurozone. I deal with German colleagues in the various files that I deal with relating to economic governance, and it's very difficult to explain to them that there is a procedure in the treaties that can, even if necessary, sanction behaviour that leads to economic imbalances when it comes to excessive balances of payment over several years. And that's something that Germany has been doing since the euro was introduced. And and increasingly so during recent years. So this German surplus is leading to a deficit in other countries, mainly in the south of Europe, but also some northern countries, or peripheral countries, if you want to call them that. And I think that is the basic problem of the euro. It's causing a situation in which there are imbalances which no one's trying to resolve. The Commission's not going to solve the problem in any decisive manner. And the reason for that is that Europe understands the idea of European Union as a kind of limited company in which Germany is the major shareholder, followed by France, UK, Italy, etc. So decisions are being taken along those lines. So it's obviously very difficult to sanction your major shareholder. So that's the situation, and that means that it's very difficult for things to change, because we have the euro, an unsustainable situation. I mean, 19 countries adopting the same currency, but with major internal divergences. That's obviously not optimal. That's obviously not great, and it's obviously not great in terms of the law as well. I mean, we saw during the second panel that there are differences between national constitutions, national laws, and European laws. They're actually these laws are often in contrast to each other. So, as our colleague was saying, this is a situation in which the project that's being moved forward is political rather than economic in terms. Now, our five-star movement is a relatively young political movement. We were born in 2009, and at the heart of our political programme, we place not the interests of old-style politics and capital, we put the interests of our citizens at the heart of our manifesto. And based on those interests, we drew up a manifesto, a political programme that really has proved very popular in Italy. We base ourselves on a strong welfare state, investments to relaunch our economies carried out by the public sector, a programme to regulate finance and the banking sector, in order to try and cut out the cancer that's eating away at the global system at the moment. And I think that's really what we need today. Our political programme, however, has made us realise that if we do want to implement it in Italy by winning elections, I mean, we're currently the second strongest political force in Italy, so obviously it's only logical for us to try and work out how we can govern the country in accordance with our manifesto. But we've found that with the Euro political project and the carving out of member states' ability to carry out its own fiscal and monetary policies, well, we would find ourselves entrapped, because without being able to implement monetary and fiscal policies, then you can't really do anything. I mean, we all saw what happened to Tsipras when he was obliged to implement a program by the so-called Euro dictatorship. The European Commission is pushing this failing program. It has been doing that for several years, and it's based on 3 pillars: the reducing public expenditure, structural reforms, which are often reforms that large capital are in favour of, and they lobby and influence the European Commission to those ends. I mean, if you look at the European Commission, then it's very easy to understand that you've got what's going on, because you've got people governing Europe now who have had a career in multinationals. And then finally, the third pillar is private investment, which basically is more privatization than private investment. I mean, state assets are being sold off, airports, ports, utilities, etc. So basically, large-scale capital is buying up everything, is privatizing everything that the state owns. So the state is basically being carved up by big-scale capital. That's the Commission's programme. I mean, the fact is that Greece and Italy are no longer national identities. They're slowly being ripped apart. Greece could basically be the name of a large investment fund, a large multinational company, because they're going in and they're buying it up as a result of these political diktats that Greece is under. So we've become aware that we need this fiscal and monetary sovereignty, because without it you can't implement a political program such as ours, which puts people at the heart of what we're doing rather than capital. And so given that, we have to try and find some kind of cross-party consensus in the Parliament to deal with the situation, because we can have a political revolution in Italy, but we can only have it if we have international support from people who share our ideas that we need to change economic governance policies. The only way for us to be able to implement our revolution is for us to abandon the Euro project, which is stopping the peoples of Europe from adopting their own political programs. I mean, our trade policies, very aggressive trade policies, are also being imposed here. I mean, let's look at how these technical bodies are acting at the moment. I mean, the fact that you have to deal with trade agreements such as the one with the US at the technical level and the one with China as well, I mean, that shows where we're going, I think. We have these supranational treaties which really regulate very important matters. The Trans-Pacific Treaty, the TTIP agreement with the United States, the granting of market economy status to China. And basically, the people who are running these policies, who are behind these policies, are large multinationals and large holders of capital. It's not governments who are trying to govern in favour of for the benefit of their citizens. It's large capital, and they're basically destroying whole economic sectors. So I think this is a dictatorship. I mean, it could be called that. They have an economic and monetary policy which via the euro has transferred and centralised power, and the European Union basically has been an organisation that has completely sold states down the river and is acting in the interests of big capital. So, I mean, we could have international cooperation, for example, to regulate the judiciary system, to regulate the monetary system. I mean, all that kind of stuff is fine, but if we're basically just carving up states so that citizens' right to express themselves are simply excluded, well, that's not fine. We're a young movement. We want to react. We have a political program. We don't want a short-term political program, as we seem to see from these people who are signing treaties, etc. We want a 20 or 30-year program which will enable us to emerge from this situation. So we need to talk to political forces from other countries in this parliament. But what's important, as well as us doing that, is that people become aware of what's going on. You have economic governance that is going to lead to a massive car crash. It's going to mean that big capital constantly gains ground over and within member states. But on the other hand, you also have a project based on international cooperation, which will have at its heart member states' possibility to govern their internal economy, to avoid crises, and to stop the economy being taken over by investment funds. So that's what we stand for, and let's now move on to an exchange of views, because it's always interesting to exchange views with members of the public. Thank you.
Grazie, Marco.
Thank you, Marco.
Introduce one of our guests, Mr. Pavel Gamov, that is a member of the Swedish Parliament for the Sweden Democrats, and he is also a member of the Committee on EU Affairs in the Swedish Parliament. So, Mr. Gamov, the floor is yours.
Tack så mycket.
Thank you for giving me the floor. And thank you for the invitation to come here today. I particularly would like to thank Peter Lundgren, a member of this house. Now, my name is Pavel Gamov, and I represent my party, the Sweden Democrats, in the Swedish Parliament. And I've been a member since 2014. Now, in the Swedish Parliament, I'm also a member of the EU Committee, and I work on international politics, particularly focusing on EU issue. So it's a great honor and pleasure to be with you here today for me. I think that we've had a very interesting day, and I've been very pleased to participate in all these very interesting discussions. As was mentioned, I represent Sweden, and I would like to share the Swedish perspective on many of the issues that have been highlighted here today with you. Now, Sweden is a member of the EU, of course. However, we're not a part of the monetary union. So we're within the third of member states that are not part of the Eurozone. This is because we had a referendum. Well, first we had a referendum, of course, on joining the EU, which we did. There was a very small minority in favor back in 1994, and then 1995 Sweden officially joined the EU. As for the euro, we had a referendum in Sweden about 10 years ago. Back in 2003 it was more precisely. And there was a referendum. People were asked about whether or not the euro should become a currency in Sweden. And fortunately, 56% of people voted against this, whereas 42% voted in favor. There were some regional differences in this referendum, but I'm very pleased to say that the Swedish political establishment respected the outcome of that referendum. However, unlike countries like Denmark and the UK, Sweden does not have any exception against implementing the euro. This is something that we in my party greatly regret. My party is a Eurosceptical party, and we always raise this issue within a Swedish political debate and when EU matters are discussed and when international affairs are discussed. Now, certain parties in Sweden, of course not all, the more right-wing party have started moving towards a more EU-critical stance, particularly a Euro-critical stance. This is something that's happened gradually. We have about 8 parties in government, in the Swedish Parliament rather, and my party is a relatively new one. We entered first in 2010 with 20 members, and in 2014 we became the third largest party with 50 members. Our party is a growing one. And in parallel, we've also seen that criticism against joining monetary cooperation, EU monetary cooperation, has been growing in Sweden. And this is something we can see in polls. About 70 to 80% of the Swedish population indicate today in polls that they would be against implementing the euro in Sweden. And there's been a constant opposition since 2003, since that referendum, although that resistance did weaken at certain points, particularly during times of economic crisis in Sweden. But we are, of course, only 1 out of 8 parties in Parliament, and we're the ones that constantly speak out against joining monetary cooperation. The Social Democrats are split on the matter. The Liberals are more favorable. As I mentioned, we don't have any red line here. as Sweden doesn't have any carve-out against joining monetary union, which is regrettable. We want to make sure that Sweden doesn't join the currency exchange mechanism. We want to see a carve-out. This is something I've raised in our parliament time and again with our Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven, but he always replies that this is a non-issue, it's a nonsensical debate, it's not something that will really affect Sweden. And we also see sort of this same tone from other parties, particularly when we discuss EU affairs. Now, we think that Sweden has done very well from being outside this mechanism and the euro, and we've seen all the tensions that have risen within Europe and the EU because of the euro. We've seen that in spite of these tensions, even more countries have joined up over time. But particularly the situation in Greece is a very telling one. It's symptomatic of what has happened because of the euro and what will continue to happen. And we see rescue packages, billions being spent on these rescue packages. And this is, of course, European taxpayers' money. And this type of policy is not one we can support from my party in any way. And I think this is very reasonable. And I think it's very clear that today's EU cooperation does not work. It's not possible to govern so many countries under the same rules and regulations and think that it's going to work. This is bound to fail, and we see that the clear cracks in the system. Now, of course, we also see that some people want to move towards a federation. The EU elite does not want any democratic oversight. They don't want individual policies in member states. They want to create a federal Europe. And this is something we will never, ever be able to support, and we will not support. And we see that, we say that clearly at home in Sweden and here in this house with our EU skeptical friends. And I mean, we have a debate, of course, in Sweden that's very similar to the one we're seeing in the UK, and we're following that debate about Brexit very closely. We'll be very interested in the outcome of the referendum. Now, in Sweden, on the issues on the matter of the euro, now we want to make sure that Sweden never joins, and we want an organization of sovereign member states that will never be forced towards any greater federal structure. So I just wanted to put that all to you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pavel, for presenting us the view from a country that is outside the Eurozone. And now I open the Q&A session for this final... okay, Mr. Luque, do you want to take the floor? Okay.
Short remark too.
Yeah.
The Swedish referendum is contrary to the treaty. It contradicts the European treaties. In the European treaties, it says that the convergence treaty at the time, 119 of the treaty, if they fulfill the convergence criteria, they have to become a member of the euro. Now, only Denmark and the UK had an opt-out. You didn't. So the question is, why did Sweden then use a referendum to decide whether they're going to be a member of the union or not? Well, the question is easy. You're not important. If you'd been important, you wouldn't have got a referendum. In terms of the Eurozone, there are two important countries, Germany and France, in the Eurozone. If Germany leaves, then there's no monetary union left. the lender of last resort would leave. So that would be that. And if France leaves, then we have a German zone, as it were. So Sweden would never have been asked, I'm afraid. That's clear. But as I said, monetary union is made up of two countries, France and Germany. They belong together. If one of them were to leave, then the character of the monetary union would be fundamentally changed.
Tack så mycket för dem.
Thank you for your views. Well, yes, thank you for those views. I agree with what you say. In Sweden, in certain contexts, we have quite a delusional self-image. We think that we're at the heart of things, that Sweden is a big player in the EU. We all want to think the best about ourselves, but it's true that it's France and Germany that are the big players. And this means that it's very, very interesting also to see what's happening in the UK. As for the convergence criteria, if you comply with them, then you are ready and eligible to enter the Euro cooperation. But at the same time, as far as I understand, we're not part of the European exchange rate mechanism in Sweden, and Sweden has not agreed to join that, and that's why we're allowed to refrain. But we will see. I mean, we want a permanent opt-out in Sweden. That's what we want to see. And as regards that referendum for 10 years ago, well, I mean, we only had a referendum because Swedish politicians knew that there was great resistance, popular resistance, and they know that now there's even greater resistance, and they're not going to try to handle that hot potato right now. And the social democrats and moderates, I mean, are smaller parties now than they were back then. So thank you.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Varainen, want to
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to remind you of the fact that in the European Parliament we have this freedom of choice contact group. Mr. Henkel mentioned it in the first section of the seminar. It has been established mainly by the Italian colleagues. Valli and Zanni have been active in the beginning, and then German Alpha Group, five members. But we have now altogether more than 30 people from different countries and different political groups. And the idea is to stress that there should be a freedom of choice in joining the Eurozone and leaving the Eurozone. And of course we are working for a decentralized union. We are against supranational federalistic union, and we would like to have a confederation or a decentralized union. I just wanted to point out that I visited with the Foreign Affairs Committee the German Parliament, and the chairman of the EU committee in the Parliament had the opinion that it should be possible to leave and it should not be obligatory to join. He mentioned that since we have now the Lisbon Treaty, according to which you can leave the whole union, it would not be logical to say that you could not have the same choice also concerning the Eurozone. It was his interpretation, and there might be different opinions in the German Bundestag. But still, it is a matter of discussion.
Yes, I think that is better if we start a Q&A session and then feed the debate. So if you have any question, please. No question from the public, so Mr. Valli will add something.
Sulla questione che ha sollevato il professor...
Well, on the issue raised by Professor Starbatti on the treaties, well, that really is fundamental, because, I mean, when a country joins the EU and then respects the convergence criteria, well, it's obliged to become a member of the euro as well. So that's one of the key issues that we've been raising in our political group recently, because a state needs to have the legitimacy to take a political decision not to join the euro, but to be able to remain part of the wider political project. I mean, the key point here is that currently in the European Union we're seeing a difference between the countries who adopt the euro and who, apart from Germany, have a very weak bargaining position, and then you have countries who are members of the European Union but haven't yet adopted the euro, and they have a pretty strong bargaining position because the constrictions caused by Brussels and Frankfurt policies to which Eurozone countries are subject to, well, they're different to the policies that Eurozone member countries are subject to. So they're less subject to pressure from Frankfurt and Brussels. I mean, obviously, the European Union's isn't based on necessarily the good of the people, but what we're calling for is a kind of opt-out clause. I mean, this is something that the UK and Denmark already have, and we think that's a good thing. I mean, we think it's good for countries to be able to leave the euro, but to remain part of a wider project, which, however, does need to be changed, and it needs to be changed. It needs to be the member states that change it. There needs to be the ones that actively change it, because I mean, currently we have a president of the European Commission who ended up involved in the LuxLeaks scandals just a few days after it exploded. I mean, this is the president of the European Commission. It was supposed to be a new page for the European Union. The citizens of Europe expressed themselves in favour of a change during the last European elections, and what happened? They ended up with someone who really embodies the old-style European system, which does the bidding of multinationals and doesn't care for the interests. It doesn't take care of the interests of its citizens. I mean, I think that's the lesson we have from the European Union. If you don't have monetary sovereignty, you won't be able to change the European project, and you won't be able to save Europe. There's another thing I wanted to bring up here, and that's that I don't think here we're talking about simply a balancing act between France and Germany. I think other countries, such as Italy, Spain, and other smaller countries that are members of the Eurozone can have a part to play. I mean, if they decided to unilaterally leave the Eurozone, well, then I think there would be a crisis triggered which would lead to the euro area falling apart. So I think it's important for Europe to have a plan B ready, because we can all see the consequences of uncertainty on international financial markets. We've seen a financial bubble, liquidity being pumped in, which markets are getting addicted to, problems potentially in emerging markets, the global economic slowdown, a slowdown in demand. I mean, there's a systemic crisis building up here, and Europe, as a result of the euro, is really in a very fragile political situation as well. So we really do need a plan B here. We really need to be aware of the fact that smaller countries could also bring down our monetary union. Thank you.
Grazie Marco. Professor.
Thank you, Marco. Professor Starbatti, would you like to add something?
Yeah, Mr.
The Lisbon Treaty states that countries may leave the European Union if they do not cause damage to the Union. What was interesting was that Mr. Luca asked Mr. Dombrovskis whether this could apply to the Eurozone as well. Mr. Dombrovskis answered that that could be the case. However, it could only happen if no damage is caused to the monetary union. And one day later, Mr. Dombrovskis retracted that and said, no, there is no such possibility. Obviously, it was politically discussed, and Mr. Juncker must have said, no, that's not possible. So he had to retract it. We've often heard that it's possible to leave the EU, but not to leave the currency union. If you want to leave the euro, then you'd have to leave the EU. That was the argument to keep in the shaky candidates in the euro. But imagine theoretically that Germany were to leave. Then what would all the others say? Please leave the EU. No, of course not. You have to continue to co-finance the CAP. So obviously Germany would have had to stay in. So it was just an argument that was taken up so that countries didn't leave. Now, if Greece were to leave, and Greece almost left, would have left if Merkel hadn't agreed, 15 countries were in favour. Only France, Greece, Cyprus and Italy were opposed. If Merkel had said, I agree with Mr. Schäuble, then that would have happened. Greece would already be on the path to recovery, with Finland as well. That's not a problem for the monetary union. It would be able to help them without damaging the monetary union. We've heard today that the monetary union is set up in such a way that is simply not sustainable in the long term. And if it turns out that with countries leaving, that the remainder are in better health, and that's good for everyone. So there has to be a decision between short-term volatility if someone leaves, and then the long-term effect. If Spain, for example, were to leave, now of course it would cause friction on Spain's neighbouring countries, those that have a lot of trade with Spain, but in the long run it would be positive. We've heard that this morning from Mr. Oppenheimer, because Spain would get its strength back and would be able to maintain employment in its country. Now the question is, what about Germany? Can Germany leave? And I'm not talking about economic difficulties. Obviously they'd be greater than if Greece were to leave, because it would have huge power of arbitrage, as we discussed this morning. That's clear. However, the question is whether in historic terms Germany can afford to do that. Greece can, historically speaking, so could Finland. However, can Germany really afford to leave for historic reasons? Everyone would be worried about the Second World War, National Socialism. Europe has saved you. How can you leave? Now, obviously, you've got to look at your values. If your values are democracy, the rule of law, and peace between peoples, then you have to say that Germany would have to leave if these values are central, because the value of Europe, or the value added of Europe, isn't the falsely constructed monetary union, but rather the values we've always stood by: freedom, democracy, peace. Now, we've heard this morning that the treaty, the way it's set up, Maastricht and Lisbon, means that certain countries have to give up their political sovereignty. If you're a debtor, and if the creditor countries have an interest in getting the money back, then they are going to dictate what happens in the country that's taken up debt. That means we've no longer got democracy for some countries. As the Portuguese Prime Minister said, he'd be proud and happy if Portugal could finally stop being a protectorate. Now, protectorate has borders, but doesn't have much to say about domestic policy. Well, that would then be to the benefit of Europe. And then why did Tsipras have to back down? He was elected twice with a majority to reject the Troika's program. And again, he allowed that to be confirmed in the referendum, that he wasn't going to do that. In fact, he came to the European Parliament. Maybe you were all there. He presented his case with gusto. He said that he was not going to allow himself to be at the mercy of a neutral or independent institution called the Troika, manned by officials. Then in the Parliament, Mr. Verhofstadt worked very hard on this. Now you need to know who he is. He's a great rhetorician. No one can really contest him. He then spoke to Tsipras. He said, you haven't done what you were supposed to have done for 5 years, and you come along again and say you don't want to do it. He says, you've always had the Parliament as a friend, but if you do not turn away from what you've promised your people, then you'll be alone in the world. You won't have any friends anymore. That shook Tsipras. He then turned away from what he'd promised and went back to obeying the orders of the Troika. Well, that's just a small anecdote to present my point.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would like to mention one more aspect. We don't have time to discuss it deeper, but there's the 5 presidents plan, how to develop the Eurozone. What is going to happen if one or several Eurozone countries do not accept that plan, key elements of that plan? Those who are in favor of maintaining the Eurozone and developing it believe that the Euro is not viable without this package of 5 presidents' plan. If it is rejected, what happens then? Should the countries which do not accept it leave the Eurozone, or what would happen? That is the question to be discussed. But as I said, I have to leave now, and I don't have any time to go deeper into this into this subject. I can only mention that the present government in Finland has in its program very strong position that we have to decrease our responsibility for the debts of other Eurozone countries. It is the opposite to the 5 presidents' plan. So if our government takes seriously its program, it has to be against the banking union, the common budget, the common finance minister, and everything in the 5 presidents' plan.
Grazie Paavo, abbiamo una richiesta di intervento dal pubblico.
Thank you very much. We have a request for the floor.
Well, Mr. Valli talked about a plan B. I think we all agree that the helicopter money from Mr. Draghi isn't a plan B, but rather it's an act of desperation. In Germany, we don't really like plan Bs. We prefer to talk about A1, A2, A3, etc. What would a good plan B look like so that all countries, in particular the people, could recover from this crisis?
Die Frage richtet sich eigentlich.
And the question is for all of the panel.
Sì. Allora, obiettivamente.
Well, as designed, economic and monetary union was designed in an incomplete manner. I think that was done on purpose. I think the point was just to implement the failing policies of the European Commission, which basically end up destroying states and mean that large financial interests take over everything that was previously public. That's my opinion. But we're not moving towards having an optimal Eurozone. We're not giving the Eurozone the tools it needs to become a proper monetary area, so that it can have pooled debt instruments, etc. I mean, also because it's extremely complex, almost impossible to do without basically ripping apart economic systems. So Plan B is really is an effort to try and save our citizens from the rapaciousness of international capital and multinationals. I mean, there is a wind of extremism which is blowing at the moment, and historically we've seen where that can lead, so we're trying to save people from that as well. And what we want to do with this Plan B is to try and find a political solution which will enable economic and monetary policies to be managed by member states, so that we can try and combat the social crisis that we're seeing in many European countries. We want to see this take place, and then we want to see international policies adopted over a 20-year period, so that we can work for a new Europe based on the proper regulation for the financial sector. I mean, banking union doesn't do away with the systemic problems we're facing. We all know that, because all the analysis that's currently being carried out on banks is focusing on credit risk. But we have financial risks that haven't been looked at. They haven't been taken account of. I mean, no one's thought of ring-fencing banking capital that's used for very risky financial products, for example. So that's the system that we have at the moment, and we won't be able to emerge from it unless we look at politics in another way. We need a long-term view, and we need to base ourselves on giving back to national states monetary and fiscal policy rights, because otherwise we're going to see systemic crises that will be very difficult to deal with.
I have only Plan A. And that is to fix it, and that would open the door for some other countries, peripheral countries, to leave the Eurozone. I don't believe in coordinated breakup of the Eurozone, as was proposed in the first section of our seminar. If my Plan A is not realized, then there might be a deep crisis inside the Eurozone. What would happen then? I don't know. I don't know if anybody has any Plan B. It is going to be a chaos and a very difficult situation for all of us. There should be some kind of an orderly dissolution of the Eurozone, because it is impossible as such. And the fix it and the following solutions would be the best choice.
Ulrike, es gibt keinen Plan.
Ulrike, there is no Plan B.
Es gibt keinen.
There is none. That would mean that we have to start thinking about the end of the Eurozone. No, there is no official Plan B. As our Finnish colleague said, no one's really saying what's happened. We're in a situation which is dynamic. It's evolving, and you can never say what's going to happen, because there are too many imponderables that affect one another, that impact one another, so it's impossible to foresee what's going to happen. For example, let's assume that the Chinese real estate bubble actually bursts and the whole Chinese economy would collapse. Of course, that would send shockwaves to us as well. Obviously, then you could say, in a context of a shockwave, at national level, people will try to find national solutions. And if we have fix-it and that's successful, and there's a devaluation, for example, and if the economy could recover and the Finns would model themselves on the Swedes, and that would have consequences. Or Mr. Schäuble talks to Mrs. Merkel and says, next time we have to just let the Greeks go. In the German Parliament, the upper house, there's a minority against further bailouts. 80 members from the CDU, CSU have voted against Mrs. Merkel's bailout. So we have a situation where we can never say what's going to happen. All I can say is that there's no coordinated conduct because everyone's holding onto the illusion that we're somehow going to make it. And then we'd have to say what's going to happen. There might be exogenous factors that would push us into a certain situation where we can try to calculate what's going to happen, but it's very difficult to say.
Thank you, Mr. Luque.
I mean, I would like to insist that, of course, there is a plan B, even though you're right, Joachim, that it is not the official plan B of any government in the Eurozone, but it is actually exactly what is laid down in our laws and in our constitution.
Yeah.
And Gunnar Beck, in his presentation, I think has made a very valid point about our constitution in saying that our constitution is basically about the rule of law. So if we just apply the rule of law in the Eurozone or in the European Union and come back to what Gunnar Beck also has very correctly pointed out as a very clear statement in Article 125 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, then there is our Plan B. And this Plan B just says, well, we don't finance anybody else's debt. And that is the way how we can fix the whole Eurozone, because if we resist to any attempts of subsidizing other governments in their situation of over-indebtedness, then these governments will either have to steer around in their economic policy on their own and manage to keep pace with other countries in the Eurozone, and then that's fine for me, then they are invited to stay in the Eurozone, no problem with that, or they have to take the consequences and say, well, we leave the Eurozone because we just don't get credit for our government anymore. And second point on the rule of law is actually that we also have to have a look at what the European Central Bank is doing. To my understanding, Greece is still receiving ELA credits for its banking system. And my question is, who actually has authorized the European Central Bank to support selectively certain ill banks of the Eurozone by ELA credits over months? And nobody is actually, nobody is actually talking about that and asking where is the democratic legitimization and where is sort of the rule of law for the European Central Bank, which would somehow limit their power here. ELA credits are being supplied on apparently on a permanent basis to Greek banks so that those banks can survive anything which actually would cause their immediate exodus in a sound market economy. So I think our plan B must be reinforce the rule of law. Thank you very much.
Grazie al collega Luque.
Would I like to thank Mr. Luque. If there are no further requests for the floor from members of the public. Are you asking for the floor? Please, last comment then, and then we'll conclude.
I come with the EFDD. I would like to ask you, I feel like in a bad dream or in the movie Groundhog Day, I think it was called. This has been debated for like 5 or 10 years already, and it seems to be going on and on. So how long do you think that this can go on? And what do you think will be the cause for any change? Is it going to be when Movimento gets into the leading position in Italy, or what's the thing going to be that's going to change it? Thank you.
Ma è una domanda da $1 milione quella.
Well, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? How long is this situation going to persist for? I mean, there's no full awareness of the problem right across Europe yet. I mean, discussions on the future of the Eurozone aren't at the same level in all Eurozone countries. In Italy, thanks to people who've been looking into this as of 2011, this discussion has reached an advanced level. I mean, it's also relatively advanced in Germany as a result of the work that our colleagues from Alpha have carried out. And more political forces in the Bundestag are starting to reflect on whether the Eurozone is the best solution for the problems Europe faces. I mean, some people are becoming convinced that actually the Euro is the cause of many of the problems that Eurozone nations are suffering. I think that a decisive point in discussions on the Euro could be when the two problems that the EU and Eurozone are going to have to face in the summer. Firstly, the Greek issue. Following the agreement reached last summer, we were already saying that Greece would be back. And I think in around July, as we've seen in the leaks that have come from the IMF during recent days, there will be a new discussion opened on Greece. And there'll be discussions as to whether Greece should or shouldn't remain a member of the Eurozone. I think it's 2 or 3 billion euros worth of Greek bonds held by the European Central Bank that will vest then. So if there's no thumbs up from creditors, then no new credits will be provided. So I think that's one key moment. And then there's another key moment which isn't directly linked to the Eurozone, but it will have a significant impact, will be the referendum, the result of the referendum in the UK. That may well have a major impact in destabilizing the situation in the Eurozone. Last summer, as Professor Starbati said, Greece was on the verge of being kicked out or of leaving the Eurozone. That would have been a major blow to European Economic and Monetary Union architecture. It may even have been a fatal blow. Now, when it comes to Italy, we're probably going to be having general elections in 2018, hopefully earlier. And at that point, any political force that really genuinely wants to change things, that wants to bring the country back to a path of sustainable growth, will have to have this plan A, B, C, whatever you want to call it, in place. Because we are going to need to reappropriate two levers that are key if you want to govern a country. Monetary policy, which all Eurozone countries have given over to an external body that is under no political control, and the levers of economic policy. We have to be aware that there are 19 states in the Eurozone, and we're all completely different, as has emerged during our discussions. We have very different economic structures, major differences in terms of the industrial fabric, major differences when it comes to the makeup of their banking and financial sectors. So that's a problem. I mean, apart from anything else, we have 24 different languages in the European institutions. So I think that shows you how fundamental the differences between us are. I mean, the classic approach is the ECB approach, one size fits all, and that's obviously never going to work. It's going to lead to greater problems because of the situation. So any government or prime minister who wants to implement a program based on renewal and growth will absolutely have to have some kind of plan B available. I mean, as Professor Sapir said at the start, an agreed plan would be the best solution. I think, unfortunately, that won't be practical, also because of a lack of time. And so, given that, when the moment arrives, hopefully as soon as possible, it'll have to be carried out by unilateral action from a member state government. If no one else wants to take the floor, I'll just draw up some kind of conclusion from today's event. We've had a very fruitful day in terms of content. The first panel was more economic and technical in nature. There we reiterated the economic reasons as to why the euro doesn't work and why the eurozone isn't an optimal currency area and why it won't be possible to correct the distortions that we're seeing in the eurozone. I'd like to thank Professors Sapir and Oppenheimer for their contributions. They had to leave early, unfortunately, because they had to catch their flights. And I'd also like to thank Professor Vaubel for his contribution on that panel. Then we held a second panel discussion, just as important as the first one. And there we looked at why the architecture of the Eurozone and the architecture of the treaties are not compatible with national democratic constitutions of Eurozone countries. We heard from Lydia Undiemi, and there we heard why the pressure from markets has contributed to putting some Eurozone countries in the situation in which they are. And we heard how leaving sectors and policies which are really key in the hands of external players can be dangerous when it comes to guaranteeing the constitutional prerogatives of citizens. I'd also like to thank Marco Mori for his contribution to that panel. He also had to catch his flight. And also I'd like to thank Professor Beck for his contribution. And then we concluded with the political discussion, the third panel. I think that really is key. We've said it several times now. This is the 6th conference we've held on the euro and the eurozone, if I remember correctly, that we've held here in the European Parliament. But I think this particular conference was particularly important because it's the first time that different political groups representing different political forces have come together to discuss this issue and to try and fuel the political discussion on the euro, which is really becoming key now. We've now got contributions from academics and researchers, and so as a result of that, we've now understood why the Eurozone isn't sustainable and doesn't work. So we've reached that point, but it's particularly important to discuss the political side because our understanding now has to take account of politics, because the only possible solution will be one that can be provided by politics. I mean, this discussion is pretty taboo at the moment, not only in national parliaments, but also within the European Parliament and other European institutions. We've heard Mario Draghi, the president of the Eurogroup, and President Juncker say that the euro is irreversible in the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee several times now. And so it's important to bring together political forces from different backgrounds so that we can try and come up with a common solution. We also have a contact group on freedom of choice, which our colleague Pavel mentioned earlier, and that's also an excellent opportunity to fuel discussions on this highly important issue. Let me conclude by thanking all those who helped us to organise this event, so our staff, all those who took the floor and who made a contribution, the representatives of the Swedish Social Democrats, Pavel Gamov, and our colleagues Peter Ljunga and others who took part in this conference. We'll certainly be organising other events of this kind, and hopefully we'll be able to involve other political groups as well as the ECR and EFDD and ALDE groups. Hopefully the other political forces in the European Parliament will want to get involved, because this should no longer be an issue that is taboo. As Professor Sapir said, we don't have a great deal of time to find a solution to our problems. There's a very high risk that the Eurozone will blow up in an uncontrollable manner as a result of perhaps an external crisis. So we really do need to launch these discussions and find a solution. So thank you again, and let's have a round of applause for our speakers. Thank you.